So, Warren is running, which means we need to get to the big elephant in the room. But also a big elephant in the room for white Americans in general that most of us have no idea we have. That being blood quantum and the entire way we view heritage in old eugenics terms. This became painfully clear over the holidays when my girlfriend and her aunt had an angry spat over genetics, race, and heritage. Her aunt claimed that they were half Belgian. She also claimed that she could distinguish Belgians from other European groups just by looking at them, similar to how Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese swear they can tell each other apart, but in actual photo lineups can't tell their ancestry at all. My girlfriend is an anthropologist, and thinking about culture as more important an identifier than genetics is so ingrained that she couldn't even grasp what her aunt wasn't getting. It wasn't until she had time to process it that she was a little shocked that her aunt was using eugenics language and didn't even realize it, as she isn't actively racist. But I get it. Growing up, I was told in the song Jesus Loves the Little Children there are 4 races, red, yellow, black, and white. I was told, just like Warren, that one of my great-great-grandmothers was a Cherokee Princess, and since Indiana, land of the Indians, doesn't recognize any of its tribes, and most were long kicked out to the west, we had no native peoples around us to interact with and challenge us on this. I took pride in my genetics, and I used this pride to learn about many of the tribes using the old Dover coloring books, as well as my dad ran a home educational supply business and stocked a lot of items from the Crazy Crow Trading Company, and I got kits from different tribal gear. I can still now make a pair of Blackfoot-inspired moccasins from scratch if it ever comes down to it, but I know now that there are multiple styles, and not just one for each tribe. But what I knew about their tribal identity was just slightly more in-depth than It's a Small World ride. I was part English, part German or Pennsylvania Dutch, and 1/64th Cherokee. And that's who I was and knew who I was, my identity. But if I was to go to England, Germany, the Cherokee Nation, or heck, even Pennsylvania Dutch America, I wouldn't be one of them. I had none of their culture at all. I'm Heinz 57 American white boy. If I moved there and had a kid and raised them in the tradition and culture, they would be one of those, but otherwise forget it. And even then, my child may not be fully accepted based on appearance. Why genetics and ethnicity get so murky. Culture is a complex learned trait, and a steep knowledge of mannerisms and perspective. I could never be any of those things. You, as a white person, if you got permission from the Cherokee Nation, could become a Cherokee citizen, and you could raise your child to be Cherokee, even if you had 0 genetic markers for their tribal region. The Cherokee Nation has African Americans in it as well, and have for several centuries, some because they bought slaves and some because tribal groups were against slavery and helped them escape and protected them as fellow Cherokee, and thanks to racism, the segments of the Cherokee Nation are trying to push the rules to kick out blacks their ancestors would have considered Cherokee because their DNA test doesn't come up right, even though they are steeped in all the same culture, traditions, and lore as their fellow person of Beringian ancestry. This is steeped so deeply that in a Facebook discussion with my congressperson, he advocated using blood quanta as a way to determine if someone gets reparations and he is black. That just raises all sorts of ethical issues. Going back to what is happening among the Cherokee. I talk to German and Irish friends who come over and hear people they view as idiots, all proud that they're German and Irish too, and they go, no they're not, they're American. To most of the rest of the world, your culture and genetics are 2 different things, though your appearance often is an indicator of your greater cultural group. People prior to the New World viewed each nation as a race, and as time went on, races changed and shifted to fit whatever political need you want it to. Why it's utterly useless and a dangerous concept. Americans are weird and special. Most of us are immigrants, and to have an American identity is very confusing, so we take pride in where our parents and grandparents came from. However, thanks to slavery and the laws that came out of it, that confusion got even worse. One-drop policy is an idea used back in the day to decide if a person had the rights as a white person. If you had less than 1/4 to 1/8 African ancestry depending on the state, you could be considered white and had rights due to a white person. If you had more than that, sorry, those legal protections don't apply to you. Blood quantum was a similar concept in relation to Native Americans. If one of your parents were of Native descent, you had a 1/2 blood quantum. If you had one grandparent of Native descent, you had 1/4. This completely ignored the fact that native tribes absorbed other tribes and people from outside, and both One Drop and Blood Quantum assumed that this baseline of heritage was pure and set in stone, even though DNA tests show that we're all over the place in mixing, and the natives especially absorb people from the outside into their tribe all the time. Once native peoples got more sovereignty over their tribes, they changed the rules, some keeping Blood Quantum, some ditching it entirely, though to get native benefits from the government, you still have to show records of your ancestry. How we define modern heritage in 23andMe is they take ancestry from peoples in an area currently and average the markers based on region, nation, and ethnic identity. So they take your DNA and tell you a story of this group they average. As they get more data points over time, your ancestry can easily change. It's so arbitrary because culturally you have zero in common with them, and it can fluctuate based on who is living in that area at the moment. That takes the DNA test that can shift you toward or away being considered from that area. But thanks to eugenics and these oppressive laws, we think that eugenic terms are obvious and black and white and never question it because we can't think of another way to think about it and completely break our old framework. The way Elizabeth Warren handled the native issue was bad. It's common family lore among white people that we have some native ancestry, and because the entirety of America, especially old America, unknowingly thinks about heritage in eugenics terms instead of culture, like the rest of the world, that means you are proudly native. I believed this growing up, as we all have an ancestor of native descent. My genes don't make me native, my culture makes me what I am, and I am white American as hell. Irish people get irritated at Americans of Irish descent, generations removed from any of the culture, because they aren't Irish. However, in a nation made up of mostly immigrants, diaspora, and slavery, heritage becomes a weird and murky area because we all need identity, and the more fuzzy it becomes, the more confused it is. What she should have done was gone to the tribe she thought she was part of and try to figure out the best way to communicate this family lore unknowingly steeped in eugenics and misunderstanding, making it a teaching moment. She instead, being in her 60s, 20 years older than me, didn't think anything of it. It was so obvious, and like so many white Americans, especially older white Americans, she didn't understand the difference between genetics and culture, and how offensive what she did was to the tribes. The fact that she got accepted into college the first time claiming Native American ancestry indicates most likely serious misunderstandings of Native laws, which was not nearly as uncommon as there was no internet around to double check if you were qualified. I knew several white guys in the Navy who were signed up as minorities because they had a very, very, very distant relative to boost the quota for recruiters. This was only 20 years ago. It's possible at the time of her enrollment, 50 years ago, the college pressed her to do the same to pad their numbers and get tax breaks, but she has said nothing about this. She did, however, apologize to the Cherokee Nation, and they have accepted her apology. She is currently my number one choice because I am not a one-sin voter, and everyone else has their own flaws and sins. Most white people I know, including my girlfriend's aunt, thinks entirely unknowingly in One Drop and Blood Quantum and has no alternative way to think about it. It's not malicious. It took years of study to purge the idea from myself, and I still don't know how to explain it to old people enough to cause a paradigm shift. This is a learning and teaching moment. People don't understand what they don't understand. We must work on this to purge the idea out because it's so ingrained into our culture, it feels like being white just makes you racist. And it is in our DNA, just our cultural DNA. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm sure there was nothing controversial about this, and everyone will happily get along in the comments section, which you can do on the YouTube version of this video, link in the show notes. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis 2814 on YouTube, and I have over 500 videos on different topics that I've made over the past 10 years. Please subscribe, and if your podcast site has the option, give me a like or review. If you think what I have to say informed you, consider supporting my Patreon. I'll be doing this podcast weekly and try to get it out on the same day, so I hope to see you here next week, ready to be filled with new ideas. Take care. A big thank you goes out to Elias Garcia Guevara and Joe Taylor, who sponsor the show at $10 a month at the Wapawet level on Patreon. Please consider donating as well if you can, and thank you all for listening.